Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the last argument of King's unit tier list for the 100 Kingdoms. This video will be a deep dive into 100 Kingdoms, who they are and how they play, through the vehicle of, yes, a tier list kind of as a means for discussion than anything else. Now, there is an awful lot of text on screen now that you might want to pause and read if you are interested in how we will go about ranking things in this tier list, but there are a couple of important takeaways. The first is that really this is just a vehicle to talk about and discuss the faction. In practice, this is going to be a bit of a faction-focused video by way of a tier list. The second thing to note is that in general we are ranking units in terms of how they function inside the faction, not in comparison to units elsewhere in the game, and in terms of usually their best use case and their commonality. To put that a slightly different way, if a unit is a mainstay or is easy to take in multiples, it is more applicable and more useful to the faction. Therefore, we're probably going to rank it higher, or at least use that to kind of split the difference inside power level tiers. As an example, you can actually see in the sample units in the tier list ranking below that Raiders are an example of a unit I would consider to be an A tier unit. Even though on their own, Raiders are a light unit, they are not hugely durable, they are moderately dangerous, but there is nothing about a single unit of Raiders that is game-breaking, but in terms of what they add to the faction, they are a light regiment that can score, they can trade, they are dangerous enough to be a threat despite being relatively cheap. And they are a mainstay in, I think, every single or just about every single warband in the faction of Nords, which makes them very, very useful to Nords. They are an extremely important and therefore valuable unit, and so we would rank them much higher than, say, some of the Jotnar in Nords, despite the fact that model for model, Jotnar are obviously much more powerful. So we're ranking here in terms of applicability to the faction, where an S tier unit dominates list construction and dominates play. An A tier unit is a core faction strength. A B tier unit is the spice of faction balance. Lots of B tier units means you have lots of different choices, but they aren't obligatory. A C tier unit is a hear me out kind of unit that you're trying to make work. And a D tier unit is a unit that just doesn't quite work in some capacity. These are ultimately going to be very rare because the design team obviously does its best to make sure that every model is in some respect usable, but there are a few models in the game that one way or the other just don't quite function in Conquest: The Last Argument of Kings, and so don't presently see fat play almost at all for that reason. So before we dive into the units themselves, let's set the stage a little bit. How do the 100 Kingdoms play as a faction? So they are built around one primary and very important rule, which is the dynastic allies rule. In 100 Kingdoms, you get 2 warlords, each of whom unlocks different faction special rules and abilities. This adds just a lot of versatility to the 100 Kingdoms and is the core of their most significant strengths. In effect, 100 Kingdoms are 4 sub-factions in a trench coat, and you pick 2 of them for any given army, trying to mix and match and combine strengths to get a whole that is unique and significant and powerful. Now, before we talk about mechanical strengths, I just want to note that the fantasy here is really compelling. 100 Kingdoms are baseline regular humans facing down unimaginable horrors, and their rules reflect that. Both their weaknesses and their limitations, which we will talk about, but also their strengths, right? The idea of dynastic allies is really compelling as a story beat because it reinforces the idea that in such circumstances, in such an environment, in such a hostile world, humanity can only survive by working together. And I find that really, really cool. I also just really like, generally, the narrative theme of being the baseline human facing down all of these strange and terrible things that the world has to throw at them in settings like Conquest. Now, in terms of mechanical strength, this produces a few different things that are quite notable. The first is that even at the competitive level of play, you have tremendous list building variety available to the 100 Kingdoms. You can go to an event. Now, 100 Kingdoms aren't a hugely popular faction in Conquest. There are many factions to choose from, and only some people will find that fantasy of the baseline human compelling, but you can go to an event and see multiple different 100 Kingdoms lists, and they will be extremely varied. This is, firstly, because the faction has really quite good internal balance, especially between the sub-factions. but also because depending on what you want to do, there is a very good chance the Hundred Kingdoms can cater to that in some respect. If there's almost any avenue of play, any tactical strength that you want to pursue in Conquest, there's a very good chance that in the Hundred Kingdoms you can incorporate that into your list in some capacity and be like one of the better factions in the game at doing it. Very rarely will you be the best, although there are a couple of things that Hundred Kingdoms actually can be the best at. But in almost any situation, you can incorporate strengths and have them be good. You can also, and this is something I really like, you can either focus very heavily on one particular thing and be like, I want my army to do this, and it will be very good at it because it will be able to do it en masse. Or you can flex those strengths into a list that has many different capabilities. And in almost any game, and Conquest is no exception, that can be very valuable. If you're playing that style of list, if you're playing a Hundred Kingdoms list that is trying to incorporate multiple strengths and multiple different abilities and different ways that you can flex the formation and development of your army, then if you are able to kind of read what your opponent's plan is, you will almost always have some kind of asymmetric strength, something that they can't do but you can, that you can leverage against them. A very simple example is that almost every Hundred Kingdoms list that I play personally is able to kind of make the decision and chart the course based on scenario aggression that its opponent is likely to exert. Most of the lists that I will play can choose to play the long game and go for a grindy attritional play that wins late against a fast, early, and aggressive list, or can choose to play fast, early, and aggressive against a list that is trying to play longer into the game and develop more slowly, like Old Dominion, for example. And being able to build that flexibility into a list to actually play in the game is something that can actually be quite rare in a style of game like Conquest. It's much more common that players will build lists that have a clear and specific strength, and they attempt to leverage that strength as best they can. And that tends to run into problems where if you are playing a list that has one particular strength, and you play into something that just does the same strength as you but is better at it, a symmetrical contest of strengths, you are less likely to, you have to play your way out of that as best you can, you are disadvantaged in the matchup. Hundred Kingdoms lists can be built to leverage asymmetric strengths, and that is rare and really valuable. Now, one of the things that Hundred Kingdoms absolutely actually just can do the best of basically any faction in the game, if it really wants to, is to pursue high activation counts. Now, this is something the strength of which has kind of waxed and waned over time as the meta has shifted in Conquest, but at time of recording, heading into the halfway point of 2025, we are now several meta iterations into a change that was made by the developers to the supremacy rules that removed a hedge against high card count, high activation count lists becoming powerful. And the community, as a result, has slowly shifted more and more and more toward trying to seek activation control in their lists. A year ago, a year and a half ago, the average activation count would have been something like, oh, 11 is good, but 10 is good, but 11 is better. It's become 11 is good, but 12 is better. 12 is good, but 13 is better. And that has shifted up and up and up as the community engages, perhaps without realizing it, in a symmetric arms race for activation control. Having the last one or two activations in a turn, which you can use to do things with those regiments that your opponent cannot immediately respond to. They can't respond until their next turn because all of their activations, all of their units have done something this turn, their activations have been consumed. Now, if you are, for example, an Australian player, this style of play is no stranger to you. Australian, particularly some of the best players in Australia, have been playing this way literally since the previous edition, because the strengths of activation control, particularly in someone who knew how to use them, have always existed. But as the hedges against activation control becoming a dominant strategy have been removed from the game, it has, surprise, surprise, emerged as a dominant strategy. But one of the things about activation control as a dominant strategy is that it is, here's this word again, a symmetric arms race. The only thing that an activation control count least wants to see is another activation control count that does it better than you can. And so we see, that's why we see this arms race in the community, where right now it's 12 is good but 13 is better. Soon it will be 13 is good but 14 is better, until we reach a point where multiple factions become non-viable because they simply can't play that level of activation count. Hundred Kingdoms can, and it can frankly build cohesive, powerful, and workable lists that go as high as 16 or even 17 activations without necessarily limiting themselves too badly. You absolutely do accept sacrifices playing a list with that activation count, but the lists function. They aren't ridiculous skews, and for any other faction to come even close to 16 activations in a list, it would have to be a ridiculous skew that is heavily compromised. And while activation count alone is not even close to the major determinant in the outcome of a game, it is becoming increasingly more important as the meta iterates and becomes to understand more and more about what it does and how it can be used. And while 100 Kingdoms have many limitations, they can be at the forefront of that activation count arms race. Now, in terms of limitations, there are definitely some baked into the faction. The biggest and most significant one is that this is the baseline human faction. That's a really cool and compelling narrative beat, but it is going to be reflected in how your faction is built and balanced. This is the faction of medium defense, generally speaking, medium resolve, and 4 wound stands. There are a small number of cavalry-only regiments that exceed that, to go to 5 and in one case 6, but by and large, 4 wounds is the number of wounds that a baseline human stand has in Conquest. Now, there are a bunch of ways that we can build resiliency into the army, but that's a limitation that you're going to run into when you go toe-to-toe with all of the unimaginable horrors that the Conquest universe will throw at you. This fragility is also reflected in our characters, and particularly recently with the release of factions like the Euroni, I am actually and surprisingly seeing duels become more and more relevant in the game. There are a few factions now with characters who are durable enough to be like, yeah, I can just risk a duel. I'm not going to die. This is a zero risk play for me. This is particularly true for the Euroni, which is why I've seen it more. They have multiple, like, very resilient characters just with deep wound counts who can reliably survive a duel against someone else. And so they can just freely declare duels against things like 100 Kingdoms, where our characters have 4 wounds and not particularly high defense, and etc., etc. And while declining a duel is not the end of the world, many of our regiments, they will be at their strongest when they have a character embedded. 100 Kingdoms have fairly efficient characters that we want to use a fair number of. And the penalties for declining a duel, while they're not game-ending, they're not insignificant either. All of the most important things about a unit are neutered in some respect when a character in it declines a duel. Your resolve is limited, your offensive output is limited because you lose access to the inspired rule, and you can't score. Those are the 3 most important things a unit does: fights, survives, and scores. And so the fragility of our characters is something you just have to be aware of as you're playing. And then finally, just in terms of ongoing balance of the faction, it is something to note that at least a few of our units have seen design team attention to balance them according to the maximum threshold of performance. Now, that's ultimately the design team's prerogative. It's going to kind of be necessary, particularly if you are balancing toward both casual and competitive play, because competition players are going to seek maximum stacked buff performance, and this is a faction that can really layer buffs and synergies because of the Dynastic Allies rule. But there are at least a couple of regiments that we will talk about as we go through the tier list part of this video, where the fact that they have been balanced, assuming they will benefit from every possible buff they can receive, means that they're not viable unless they are receiving every possible buff that they can receive. And that means that all of the flexibility you get from the Dynastic Allies system, seeking these different synergies and layered buffs and different ways that you can build things, actually contract back down, at least as far as that particular unit goes, because it will only work under narrow circumstances. Overall, though, 100 Kingdoms are a wonderful faction to play and collect. I play them, I collect them. While I have played games with every faction in Conquest: The Last Argument of Kings, there's only a few that I have chosen to actually bite the bullet and buy models for, and 100 Kingdoms are absolutely one of those. And they have rewarded that really pleasantly. The variety of list construction especially makes them, over the long term, a really nice investment, for lack of a better term. I can keep playing 100 Kingdoms for a really, really long time. If you were to ask me what one faction can you get the most experiences out of in Conquest: The Last Argument of Kings, 100 Kingdoms will be one of the foremost answers that I can give. And so, with that stage set, let's jump into the tier list. Now, as we go through this, the units are going to be arranged by type and then approximately by subfaction, noting that many units will share a couple of different subfactions. We'll talk about each in terms of their battlefield role and then give them, because this is a tier list, a ranking. And we're going to start with the Humble Noble Lord. Now, the Noble Lord is one of two feudal characters, which means that they belong to the feudal dynastic alliance, which is the plays well with everything alliance. Feudal do a couple of things that are very important. The first is that they just pick up all of the rules and abilities of the ally that they are joining. So, for example, a feudal Theist list, all of your feudal regiments will count as Theist. That's quite useful, but it would not itself make a particularly good sub-faction because all of the Theist units are also all Theist units, unless there was also some benefit to being feudal. And that benefit is actually possibly one of the simplest but most powerful army-wide rules in 100 Kingdoms, which is the aura professional troops that come from different feudal characters. Any regiment within 8 inches of a feudal character gets to reroll 6s in clash and defense rolls. And that's like not colossal, particularly if your defense is not huge, or your clash is not huge, but it's always on, it's passive, and it adds up a lot over time. There are also some regiments that benefit particularly well, like if you have higher defense, your defense 3 hardened 1 or defense 4, that reroll 6s starts to add more and more, up more and more. If you are high clash, the reroll 6s adds up more and more because those 6s that you are rerolling are more likely to convert into actual successes. And that aura is really, really good, and you need feudal characters to generate it. And there are only 2 feudal characters, and the Foot Feudal Lord is comfortably the better of the two. He or she is cheap and eminently customizable, and that just makes her pleasingly efficient. Generally speaking, as a baseline, these characters are going to have 6 attacks with cleave 1. Now they're going to be clash 3, but because of their own aura, they'll also be rerolling 6s, which makes them kinda effectively clash 4. They're getting the same effect as if they were clash 4 when they inspire. And while that's a long way away from the damage output some of the best characters in the game can produce, for only 80 points, you really can't ask for a great deal more. They are efficient. They're also pretty good vehicles for force multipliers. 6 native attacks means you can stack certain artifact and weapon combinations on them. A particular favorite of mine is Calidburn and Eccentric Fighting Style, which takes the feudal character from 6 attacks with cleave 1 to 8 attacks, cleave 1, flurry, enemies reroll successful defense rolls, which is, yes, expensive. At that point, they're a 130 point character, but that actually is pretty close to high watermark for the amount of damage you can get out of a single character in the game of Conquest. And so that flexibility, but more importantly, the role that they play in the army generally. 80 points is cheap as far as just getting an activation goes. They add good output to a unit that they're in, and they generate one of the most important passive buffs available to any list that is using them as a character, i.e. any feudal list, makes them pretty cleanly an A-tier character, especially by the rubric of if this was nerfed, it would be very bad for the faction. Now, much more difficult to rank is the mounted feudal lord, because almost all of the same things I just said about the feudal lord apply. Generates the aura, provides access to that very important buff. It's also especially worth noting that if you are running cavalry and in particular household knights, it is going to be very frequent that household knights can only stay in the buff aura of a foot noble lord for so long. Household knights are faster units, significantly faster than speed 5 men-at-arms. And if you want to make use of that speed, they will invariably at some point be forced to leave the professional troops aura being generated by the Foot Lord, which means that if you want to reliably give that buff to household knights, you kind of need a mounted lord to be embedded in with them. On top of that, the Mounted Lord has probably the most flexible warband in 100 Kingdoms. They can access as mainstays, probably the widest selection of troops, including things like Household Knights and Mounted Squires, which you would otherwise be forced to spend a restricted slot on in other warbands. All of which should make them kind of just better than the Foot Noble Lord. Except for 2 things. The first is, offensively, they are less dangerous. They just have fewer attacks. The best general damage output you can get from a Mounted Noble Lord is the same as a Foot Noble Lord, but with 1 less attack. Yes, he's more durable. Yes, he has some impact attacks, but his ability to fight a sustained combat is just less, which means he's less susceptible to being force multiplied. Now, that's a minor thing. The more significant thing is that he is our most expensive character, and he does not justify that. The Mounted Noble Lord is a whopping, eye-watering 130 points. He is more expensive and personally significantly weaker than something like a Priary Commander, and there is just nothing about him except for the warband selection that justifies that price cost. Now, in previous versions of 100 Kingdoms, I have run a Mounted Noble Lord. I will probably continue to run a Mounted Noble Lord at least somewhat, because I really liked having access to Household Knights, but Household Knights are a unit that has recently received a small but significant price increase to bring them more in line with what their peak performance looks like. And those points inefficiencies in a faction that really relies on efficient characters and units to hold its own against the focused power of many other factions in the game makes taking the Mounted Noble Lord a bitter pill to swallow. Now, I am going to rank the Mounted Noble Lord low. He is going to be a C tier character, but that is reflective of my personal need for efficiency in units that I play. I need units to do their job, but I need them to do their job relative to the points I spend on them. I do not find 100 Kingdoms especially has space for vanity picks in any of the regiments you might take. Everything has to basically function well relative to its points cost, because there are no apexes of strength that we can flex in this faction apart from activation count. And for that reason, the massive and eye-wateringly large premium the Mounted Noble Lord pays over every comparable character just for access to his warband puts him pretty much in the bottom of C, despite the fact that, yes, he can still be and will still be played by other players who have different opinions on how important that kind of value proposition is for a regiment. Now, next up, and actually in a similar position, although not nearly as bad, is the Imperial Officer. The Imperial Officer is important because it is the only Imperial character that you can take if you want access to the Imperial subfaction, and the Imperial subfaction is pretty cool. The dynastic abilities that you get access to by taking the Imperial Officer are Vanguard 5, which is the largest Vanguard. I think there are some Vanguard 6 regiments in the game, but Vanguard 5 is a good level of Vanguard. That so 5 extra inches of movement on the first march onto the battlefield on any 2 Imperial infantry regiments per turn, which usually will add up to 4 to 6 different infantry regiments over the course of the game, which allows for not just some very aggressive deployment, but also very aggressive reinforcement of existing forward-placed positions. An Imperial list is very good at setting the line of conflict far up the table and either using that to claim space, or if it needs to cede that territory to gain attritional advantage over the course of the game. Being able to back up if you need to is actually a very important thing in Conquest. It's difficult to do. Many players do not natively lean into the idea because the game seems to punish you for moving backwards by making moving backwards difficult, but moving backwards in Conquest when it is important to do so can be one of the most simple but important tactical decisions that you can make. Having space to do so can be really important. Vanguard, especially Vanguard on such a large number of things, is a really good rule. The activated supremacy is also really nice. 3 reforms and the opportunist rule for all veteran infantry, importantly not Imperial infantry, which opens up synergies with other subfactions, like for example Theists, who have plenty of veteran infantry of their own. Now, the benefits of the Imperial army notwithstanding, and they are really quite appealing, the Imperial officer himself is a little bit of a mid character as far as it goes. The body that he brings to the table is completely uninspiring. There are multiple wizard characters in the game who are just much better at combat than he is. He is literally equivalent to a 30-point man-at-arms stand plonked into the front rank of a unit, which means that in many cases he actually actively weakens the unit that he is joining. His resolve is low, sitting at only 3, which is low for a character that's meant to have leadership capabilities, and he is completely unable to fight in a duel, and because of that, and his weak personal combat ability taking up a important slot in the front rank of a unit, he weakens the regiment that he joins in 2 ways. Firstly, he weakens it due to the fact that he makes the regiment susceptible to duels. If you take a big block of Gilded Legion and you put the Imperial officer in it, they are worse than if they just had a Gilded Legion stand there. Strictly speaking, his addition very, very, very slightly moves the needle forward on their offense because they have good support. But paying 100 points for that doesn't feel great. But more importantly, putting him in the unit means that your opponent can declare a duel with like any character in their entire army and suddenly force your Gilded Legion to not be scoring, reroll ones to hit, reroll ones on resolve rolls, and not be able to benefit from Inspired, which sucks. That's significant. Now, what he does do is bring a really cool set of battlefield orders, which are some of the most powerful, at least conceptually, kind of rules you can access in the game. At the start of any turn that the Imperial officer is present on the battlefield, so not the turn he arrives from reinforcement, which can occasionally be important, you can hand out to 2 different infantry units within 12 inches of him, which is a very wide radius, any of 4 different buffs. That, in concept, is really, really cool. In practice, what he does is he gives hardened 1 to any 2 infantry regiments, because basically every other rule that he can hand out, that's a little bit unfair, but the rest of the rules he can hand out are niche. Not useless. The other ones that you will have access to are, rather than giving out infantry regiment hardened 1, he can rally broken regiments. Out of sequence rallies at the beginning of the turn are something that you do not always need, but it is a very good ability to have access to when you do need it. That opens up just a number of different play possibilities, defensive and offensive, that can be really significant. Secondly, he obviously gives out hardened 1. Thirdly, he gives out Murderous Volley. Murderous Volley is if a ranged unit performs an aim action and is targeting an enemy within 12 inches of them, their ranged attack causes resolve rolls. This, I think, across 15 or 16 games using an Imperial officer, I have had inflict a total of about 3 wounds. Now, it is theoretically possible to build around this, but this is strict consolation prize stuff for when you do have ranged units and they are within 12 and are able to aim, and there is no point handing out hardened because of whatever you're playing against. If that sounds niche, you're right, it absolutely is. This is something I would like to see them change in future updates, because aim for the head as an order sounds really, really cool, but the rule doesn't do anything right now, and that's one of the things that's holding back the Imperial officer in terms of flexibility. You take him because you want hardened, and there are other ways to get that in 100 Kingdoms. Finally, his 4th order gives a unit that is on an objective, Iron Discipline. I have never used this. I have never needed it in any game I have ever played with the Imperial officer. This could be removed and there would be no change to his overall power level. Now, all of that collectively, particularly given that he is the only way to access the Imperial subfaction, adds up to a character that is on the cusp of breaking into nice, clean B tier territory. He's not quite there yet. The fact that he clocks in at a very expensive 100 points to usually weaken the regiment that he is part of if he's in a frontline combat regiment means that much of the time you are forced to put him in lighter regiments that just like hang around in the rear with the gear, which is then a waste of his forward force ability, which you'd really like to have access to on powerful heavies. Like, all of that tension coupled with his high cost means that from a competition perspective, he's slightly behind the curve. He is a little difficult to use. Not by any means impossible, and while we are going to put him in C tier, he is pretty close to the top of C tier as far as 100 Kingdoms go. He's got slight vibes of, okay, hear me out, but overall his inclusion in any given list usually will make sense, particularly given that the warband he brings is pretty cool, and the subfaction he gives access to is also pretty cool. He's a little bit of a tax as a result, but the overall package is neat. Up next, we have technically the second Imperial character, but in practice, the character that doesn't have any individual battlefield role. She has the Imperial tag, but it doesn't mean anything ever since she was cruelly and unjustly stripped from her ability to be a dynastic ally, the Chapter Mage. Now, despite the fact that I am personally extremely salty about the fact that she can't be a dynastic ally anymore, because she unlocked access to the Imperial faction in a way that was a much lower overhead than the Imperial officer did, on her merit, she's a perfectly sound and solid character. She is, by the standards of almost every other wizard in the game, fairly middle of the road, but she's only 80 points, and the spells that she has access to, particularly the Water and Fire school of spells, are really solid. She has that really nice thing that happens where the spell selection she's got, which is going to be 2 spells from her school, and then a couple of spells that are generic and which every wizard gets, gives her the something to do basically every turn. Even the Water Mage, in addition to her extremely solid healing spell, has access to an offensive range spell and a couple of defensive spells, and the Fire Wizard, in addition to its very solid Fire Dart offensive spell, can cast a few light defensive spells if there's nothing in range of Fire Dart. Coupled with the fact that she has a personal ranged attack, which is Barrage 4 at 18 inches on Volley 3, that's just really solid. And at an 80-point price tag, that makes her just a cool buy in any given army. Now, ultimately, you do have to find a regiment to put her in, and that's where the biggest weakness of her comes in. She has a warband that consists of men-at-arms and mercenary crossbows, and literally nothing else. And 100 Kingdoms, and this is the biggest limitation of her, 100 Kingdoms is a faction where the mainstay meat and potato stuff is often fine to okay, But unlocking restricted regiments really does sometimes feel like you have to reach, particularly to get like the second restricted regiment in any given warband. The fact that she doesn't have any restricted at all, and is usually just going to end up in mercenary crossbows, which are kind of mid and serve only as a vehicle for the chapter mage, is the closest extent to which her otherwise efficient battlefield presence becomes a little bit difficult to accommodate. Now, her in a unit of crossbowmen, her in a unit of men-at-arms, if you specifically want her to arrive later, which can have some merit, right? Later arrival of a water chapter mage can be quite useful because you then know, if she turns up on turn 3, you know where it is she's going to be needed, whereas a fire wizard can project threat easily and early in the game. You put that in a crossbow unit. In a water mage, you might choose which of the two regiments you put her in. The fact that she is kind of feeling like she leaves money on the table by not having access to any restricted in her warband at all does feel a little bit difficult to use in 100 Kingdoms. On her merits, though, in terms of just baseline wizards with lots of flexibility, she's a piece that I really like. I have 2 chapter mages, the second is a conversion, and I have absolutely used both of those chapter mages in a couple of different lists, but even one of them is just a really nice, provides interference, provides utility, just a good spice of life addition to almost any list, and so she fits very cleanly into the B tier category for the faction. Next up, we have the Theist Priest, who is the first of 2 Theist characters, and a little bit like the Imperial Officer, does to an extent gate your access to the Theist subfaction. Now, strictly speaking, does not have to be the Warlord. You can have a Crusading Noble Lord as your Theist Warlord, and that will unlock the Theist faction. However, literally everything that is significant about the Theist faction, apart from a little bit of their indomitable ruling, their morale defense, comes from having access to a Theist Priest. And you get a lot out of access to the Theist faction. You get sort of 3 overall things. You get Indomitable 1 given to every regiment that is within a certain range, 12 inches of a Theist character. That's just nice. Good Resolve is nice. That Indomitable can stack even higher if you have a Crusading Lord warband. Secondly, you have Divine Purpose on all veteran Theist regiments. Divine Purpose is plus 2 inches of movement to your first march or first charge in an activation, so plus 2 inches either of march or of charge threat. That's really cool. If you have been targeted by a Theist spell this turn. Okay, so we need a Theist Priest or an Archangel who generates an aura who does the same thing, who is only in a Theist Priest's warband. Finally, you have the Spirit Shines, which is an activatable once per game supremacy, but it is a very powerful one. There's a bunch of words related to it, but it may as well boil down to your whole army gets blessed for a turn. And your whole army gets blessed for a turn is an incredibly good and flexible surge of power at a critical point in the game. All of that is gated around taking a Theist Priest in your lists, and so if you are playing Theist, well then you need the Theist Priest. Now, this probably sounds a lot like I am setting him up for a similar ranking to the Imperial Officer, but unlike the Imperial Officer, the Theist Priest functions just perfectly well as a character in his own merits. His combat output is not great, but it's not terrible. He is basically an Imperial Officer with Cleave 1, and Cleave 1 makes plenty of difference. Among other things, it makes him a little bit more of a vehicle for force multiplication. If nothing else, he will have Blessed once per game, and Blessed on his own regiment whenever he casts it. But his spellcasting is also really powerful. He also generates all of the Theist auras, etc., which is relevant, but the spellcasting, unlocking both Divine Purpose and most of the time, look, frankly, you will pick between one of a couple of things, but my personal favorites, and here's a good spell selection, my personal favorites are Holy Fire, which is just a good offensive spell. For each success, it inflicts 2 hits. That's just good. There are lots of regiments in the game these days with rules like Tenacious 2 against ranged attacks, which don't have any equivalent defense against spellcasting, and so having things like Chapter Mages and Theist Priests to do offensive ranged spellcasting against those units is a very good way of circumventing your opponent's defenses. But beyond even that, the fact that he can cast a spell every turn and give the regiment that he is in Blessed just about, not completely, but it just about means that the regiment he is in almost always has Blessed, because he has Devout, which means that even in larger regiments, through interference, he has a very good chance of succeeding. And Blessed is an extremely good rule. And so, because of a combination of those things, because the subfaction he gives access to is very compelling, and because he is quite coherent as a character, and because he's not 100 points like the Imperial Officer, he is a very reasonably costed 90 points. He actually fits in kind of at the bottom of A tier, just a really solid and good to have access to character. Next, we have the Crusading Noble Lord, who is our second Theist character and another solid addition to the faction. Now, there are a number of things he does, And the important thing to note is that almost all of the rules that he has access to are solid and functional and nice additions. His entire warband gets Indomitable +1, which will stack with the Theist bonus, meaning that generally speaking, his entire warband is Indomitable 2, coupled with natively high resolve. For example, his own resolve is 4, which is the highest you will get on a character in 100 Kingdoms. Means that his warband is going to be the closest you get to being immune to resolve damage in 100 Kingdoms. I have had games where his warband took 0 resolve damage over the course of the entire game, thanks to the combination of high resolve and Indomitable. He also gets to choose a selection of buffs for the regiment he joins, although in practice you should probably always choose Terror 1, but that's a really good rule. And on top of all of that, he's just a personally solid melee combatant. He has Flurry and Cleave 2 and 5 attacks, and if you've picked the Terror benefit, he'll benefit from the Terror that his unit instills. 5 attacks, Cleave 2, Terror 1 is just a good offensive profile, particularly on a character that's also helping the defense of the unit by bringing Resolve 4. Now, in terms of downsides, he is pricey. He is 100 points, but he's 100 points of fully functional rules. And he's 100 points, and that price is kind of accelerated further by the fact that you will usually have to pay for veterancy on his regiments. A lot of 100 Kingdoms units can have access to extra effects if they are veteran, and those are very, like in Theists, you will have Divine Purpose if you are veteran. That means that you need to pay manually for veterancy on all of the units in his warband, which means that in practice, a warband led by a Crusading Noble Lord is going to come in at like 40 or 50 or 60 points more than the same warband led by a regular feudal Noble Lord, but you get quite a lot for that. My personal experience is that he's not going to be taken terribly often in a feudal Theist army for that reason, but especially if you're interested in playing feudal Imperial, he can have quite a place there because not feudal Imperial, Theist Imperial. In Theist Imperial, you have no need for feudal characters, but you do want Imperial regiments, and a Crusading Noble Lord in a unit of men-at-arms is an Imperial, Feudal, and Theist because he gives them the Theist keyword, which means it benefits from all of the benefits of Imperial and Theist army rules. And at that point, the premium you pay and all of the benefits you get is really quite worthwhile. So a bit like the Chapter Mage, slightly behind her, but a bit like the Chapter Mage, he sits comfortably in the middle of the B tier, just a good solid character to have. Next, we have the Priary Commander. Now, technically, the Priary Commander comes in 2 variants, Crimson Tower and Sealed Temple, but we're ranking both as the same character. We're consolidating them for the purposes of this tier list, because among other things, there was only one picture in Army Builder and I didn't want to duplicate them, and there would be basically no difference in any case. Now, the Priary Commander is one of 2 characters that you can pick to get access to the Orders subfaction, and generally is the one that you will pick if you want access to the Orders subfaction. At the moment, there are only cavalry regiments in the Orders, but they are slated for Order of the Sword and Order of St. Lazarus releases, both of which will be foot troops. But at time of recording, this is an all-cavalry warband led by a cavalry character, and there's a solid and interesting mix of cavalry there. Now, for my money, the Orders are the weakest overall sub-faction in the 100 Kingdoms. The benefits that they give are just overall a bit less impactful than other choices. If you play as the Orders, then all veteran regiment command stands and veteran characters get Flurry. And if you're going, oh, isn't that really just quite similar and doubling up on the benefits you get from being feudal where you reroll 6s? Yes, it is. And that's a bit of a point of tension if you want to play an Orders feudal list. And if you play an Orders Imperial list, there's just no points of commonality anywhere between the two, which makes fitting Orders into the 100 Kingdoms the most difficult of any sub-faction. They just don't have a ton of synergy or overlap in terms of like the roles that they produce with the whole rest of the faction. Now, when the foot order troops come out, that assessment might change because at that point, you will have access to veteran infantry regiments, which means if nothing else, the Imperial activated supremacy will apply to part of your order troops. But for now, Flurry on command stands is just a much weaker rule than everything else that is being offered by the whole rest of the faction. Something in Orders could definitely afford to change, but that's a question for the developers, not for this tier list. Now, with that said, the Priary Commander himself, just on his own merits as a character, goes super hard. This is a 120 point character, but this is what you get if you pay 120 points for a pure combat character. High attacks, high wounds. This is the one of the only 6 wound characters that you have, like, is in the game generally, but this is a 6 wound character, which means that you can just take those duels that every other character in 100 Kingdoms doesn't want to take, because you are 6 wounds with 4 defense and 4 or 5 resolve and plenty of attacks and etc. That's wonderful. These are also premium combat characters just generally. 6 or 7 attacks plus impacts, very good clash of 4, and they will either have flurry if you're taking them as orders, or even if you are splashing orders into, say, an Imperial feudal list, you can stack force multipliers on this guy. If you're willing to take 170 points in one character, you can take either Order Commander and give them eccentric fighting style and Caliburn, and have, I think, possibly the most dangerous character in the game in terms of damage output from one person on a charge clash. Now, 170 points is not cheap, but that's really, really cool. It particularly blows Mounted Noble Lord completely out of the water, who is 10 points more than the Priary Commander and weaker by a huge margin across every measurable metric. I don't actually fully understand that, except obviously that it is related to the synergies and special rules and warbands, etc. that those characters bring. There is a cost associated with that. But what you get out of the Priary Commander is the best combat character in the faction, with the limitations being that orders as a sub-faction don't offer particularly much or synergize particularly well, but a warband that is pretty cool. Sealed Temple and Ashen Dawn are both excellent regiments, and while Crimson Tower are a bit behind the curve, there's still plenty that you can do with all 3 of these cavalry regiments. If you play a Sealed Temple Priary Commander, Sealed Temple or Mainstay, that's fantastic, and you'll unlock Ashen Dawn as restricted. If you play a Crimson Tower Priary Commander, you get probably the more powerful of the 2, because he has Terror, which he then bestows effectively on his unit, which is really good, making the Crimson Tower Priary the better of the 2, by a small margin, but the better of the 2. Now that requires you taking Crimson Tower as a mainstay. They're not unsalvageable, they fit in the okay, hear me out category, but because he's a bit more powerful, you then unlock having him either in a unit of Sealed Temple, taken as restricted, that's a fantastic unit, or one of the best 4-model Death Stars in the game almost, a Priary Commander of the Crimson Tower embedded in a unit of Ashen Dawn, which is, every now and again people will ask, man, shouldn't Ashen Dawn have terror? They seem terrifying. Yeah, that would be incredibly powerful on them. However, if you want that, you can still have it by taking an Order of the Crimson Tower Priary Commander and putting him in the Ashen Dawn. That is the only way to get to 4 stands in an Ashen Dawn regiment. They're otherwise limited to MSUs, to 3. And while that regiment costs very close to more than a fifth of your entire army, or about a fifth of your entire army, it goes really, really hard. So he is very cleanly, again, just one of those units that fits in the B tier. He is a good, solid unit, not for many, many, many lists, but when you take him, he is solid, kind of on his merits, even if orders as a sub-faction are a bit behind the curve. We're going to place him just above the Crusading Lord, even though Theists overall are much more powerful than the orders. Now, finally, we have the Errant of the Order of the Shield. Now, the existence of the guy in this game I am a huge fan of. I think it's a slam dunk decision from Parabellum. He was previously a very expensive, not very useful unit attachment, and they just made him into a character. That's incredible. Just a really good decision. The idea of him as well is very compelling. The Order of the Shield are individuals who go out and try and dispense justice in a system that otherwise is very heavily weighted towards the elite and the nobility. He's the defender of the downtrodden, he administers justice to those who otherwise would have none, and in battle, he brings along those friends of his, just very humble units, Militia and Men-at-Arms, but with restricted Ashen Dawn, Crimson Tower, and Sealed Temple. That's a really compelling idea for a character and a warband. And the idea of being able to access, to take cheaper meat and potatoes mainstays to unlock just a few elite, powerful reinforcement elements, that's really interesting. However, after that, the Errant of the Order of the Shield falls apart. Now, his combat prowess is very close to the Crusading Lord, except that it is worse for the same number of points. He doesn't have access to Terror, he doesn't have native access to Flurry, he's 5 attacks cleave 2, which is great, but a Crusading Noble Lord for the same cost is 5 attacks, cleave 2, terror, and flurry. You can give the errant flurry by taking him in the Orders subfaction, but if you take the Crusading Lord in the Theist subfaction, he gets all of the benefits of the Theist subfaction, whereas the errant is playing catch-up just to the base level of the Crusading Noble Lord. More than that, however, the errant is written as though he should buff all of the regiments in his warband, right? Provide his inspiring, like the benefits of his leadership and of their devotion to him, of all of his like peasant militia and men-at-arms that follow him into battle. And he does make them all veteran for free, which is a saving of 10 to 20 points, which is fine. But he otherwise has paragraphs of rules that do nothing. There is a rule called Gods Among Men, and you can go and read it. And if you go, oh, that seems what is that? It rallies broken regiments if it's a waxing moon, and is out of sequence rallying partway through a turn. Am I going to be use that for? No, like he's just got paragraphs of rules that do nothing. He does give Fearless to the regiment that he joins, which is great. That's a nice little buff, but there is just not enough there to hang the theme of him on. And especially those paragraphs of rules that feel like they are baked into his cost, but which don't actually do anything, is ultimately what consigns him kind of to the D tier. The D tier is the space we reserve for units that don't actually do what it is that they're supposed to do, that do not deliver in any way on the promise of the unit. And while the Errant of the Order of the Shield ultimately has a huge amount of potential, and I suspect that, like, you fast forward less than a year, right? In future updates, I would be very, very unsurprised if he was addressed in some capacity by the design team, and we see Errants of the Order of the Shield singular, because you only have one, appearing in lists. For now, I have tried to put him in lists, I have played him in games, and it just, between the weakness of the Orders as a subfaction, not weakness, but just limits, right? Limited effect as a subfaction, I have run him as a means of getting Ashen Dawn into Imperial feudal lists, and that's been fine. But he is, at least for now, badly encumbered by the fact that a huge amount of the text in his stat block doesn't do anything. And so, a little bit tragically, he sits in the D tier, although I very, very much hope and kind of expect that will change in future. Now, moving on to our infantry, our medium regiments, men at arms. Now, these guys are humble. They are 110 points for extremely baseline human stats. Clash 2, 4 attacks, defense 2, shield, resolve 2, 4 wounds. There is nothing at all there that is incredible or outstanding, except for the single most important attribute on any unit's card, which is the cost. They are 110 points and 30 points per additional stand. They also have very easy access to the veteran upgrade thanks to being a feudal regiment. It's only 10 points. They will be given it for free in many different warbands. And veteran gives them support too, which lets them scale up a little better as a regiment and unlocks basically all of the buffs from all of the subfactions that key to being veteran. On top of that, they have a 15-point upgrade that gives them Hardened 1, and when you go to Defense 2, plus the Shield, plus Hardened 1, plus the Feudal Aura, plus whatever sub-faction buffs are being handed out, they are an Imperial regiment natively, they're Imperial Feudal, so even in a Theist list, if you have a Crusading Lord in one of these, it's still an Imperial regiment, you'll get the Imperial sub-faction buffs if you're allied to them. In a feudal army, you'll get those buffs. What you get is a unit whose damage output is not hugely significant, but they are cheap and accessible and mainstay, and they scale very well into a unit that can hold for multiple rounds and brawl at least a little bit, and whose damage can be supplemented by the characters embedded in them, which makes them, overall, the best unit in the entire faction. There is no single regiment in 100 Kingdoms that would be a bigger blow to the faction if they were nerfed by the design team than Men-at-Arms. Now, do I play Men-at-Arms in every list? Actually, yes, I do play Men-at-Arms in every list. Should I play Men-at-Arms in every list? No, probably not. But they are a baseline meat and potatoes unit that forms the foundation of so many strategies and combat units and different ways the faction can flex that they are just incredibly important. They are humble, but they are a core factional strength because they act as a vehicle for many different strategies, whether it's receiving Vanguard, or Fluid Formation, or the defensive buffs of Feudal, or the resolve buffs of Theist, or the offensive buffs of Theist. All of these different things will always, you can rely on men-at-arms to be a unit that works with your army, and because they don't cost very much, even a 5-strong unit with a character in them only costs 170 points for the men-at-arms themselves, plus 80 points at the entry level for the noble lord that's leading them. That's 250 points for a 6-stand, 2 activation, character that does some damage, just humble but extremely solid, reliable building block that then benefits from further force multipliers. I have never, under any circumstance, heard someone say, man, men-at-arms are broken, and so they are comfortably shy of the S tier, but they are just so useful and fit into so many lists and form the basis of so many different strategies that they are an A tier regiment for that reason. I own 10 stands of them, and I think I might need more. Next, we have Militia, and we're kind of just going to rank both Militia kind of similarly and at the same time because they're easy to talk about as a group. Militia are the light and cheap and cheerful 100 Kingdoms unit, Force-Gone Drone kind of equivalent thing. Now, Militia on paper are primed to kind of almost occupy a similar spot to the men-at-arms, but they ultimately fall short. They are a light regiment. Militia, the melee militia, are very slightly cheaper and technically very slightly more dangerous than men-at-arms. 100 points for a base unit, 5 points to become veteran, and veteran makes them support 3 up from support 2, which means that theoretically a very large block can put out a very large number of attacks. However, like men-at-arms, they are 30 points per stand, which means that by the time you get to a large regiment, there is almost no difference in terms of cost between an equivalently sized militia and men-at-arms block. And lack of access to hardened, but more critically, being only defense 1 plus a shield, ultimately thoroughly constrains how well you can run large blocks of militia. It is possible to run them. I have tried it in multiple configurations, but their fragility does always ultimately shine through, which is fine because they're not that expensive. We don't want a situation where militia Death Stars reign supreme over the meta. They're a light regiment. Light regiments should innately be constrained in terms of either damage or durability or both, and they are. Similarly, you have militia bowmen who are terrible. They are terrible at everything. They are terrible at shooting. They are terrible at fighting, but they are 80 points, which makes them the single cheapest regiment in the entire game, no exceptions. And I mentioned with men-at-arms that cost is the most important balancing attribute about any regiment in the game, and militia bowmen are no exception. Now, even though I am significantly an activation enjoyer as far as army design goes, I do not spam militia bowmen because 80 points for a regiment that does nothing but provide an activation, that is not kosher. However, 80 points as the carrying point for a Theist Priest, for example, or if you absolutely must have a mainstay to unlock a restricted, 80 points that does literally one other thing and is an activation and a unit that you deploy and can even score if there's a character in them or 4 stands natively, that's fine. It's just fine. They are exactly at the balance point that units in this weight class doing this kind of thing at this cost should be, which is comfortable, middle of C tier, just like the rest of the other things that are sitting there right now. Middle of B tier, rather. We're going to rank the militia spearmen very slightly higher because there are more use cases for them, right? You can run them as larger units in different configurations. Some lists will make that work. Ultimately, though, they sit kind of next to each other and with good reason why. Next, we get into the mounted squires. This is a unit that has recently seen a points reduction, although even at 130 points, this is a relatively uninspiring profile with one exception. These guys are human standard. They are in fact literally just men at arms on horses for a nominal points premium, 130 points for the regiment, plus 10 points to make them veteran, and with the downside of being restricted in feudal foot lords warbands, although they are mainstay in a mounted noble lord, but they are speed 9. And speed 9 with a banner is very, very fast. Now, some subfactions, particularly the Imperial subfaction, can get a facsimile of that speed by using Vanguard to set similar reinforcement lines, but if you need to be on the board and up the board early, there is nothing that we have access to in 100 Kingdoms quite like a light mounted squire arriving on turn 1. You can, if you have access to the slots, even run these guys in pairs, either spreading them apart or running them together to mutually support one another. In the latter case, their opportunist rule tends to allow them to do actually a little bit of damage against anything that comes after them. I quite like, particularly at 130 points, If you have access to veterancy for them for free, paying 10 points is a bit much, but if you have it for free, they gain Tenacious 2 against range attacks. And that just gives you a nice overall package. Now, the biggest limitation of these guys is that they are restricted in a Foot Lord's Warband and only mainstay in a Mounted Lord's Warband, and my position on Mounted Lords I think is visible from this tier list. That accessibility, competing for restricted slots, is the biggest thing that holds them back. Otherwise, they're a wonderful little unit to have access to, 1 or 2 in a list. Adds capability that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And for that reason, we can't put them any lower than the B tier because they're a nice thing to have in the lists that you take it in. They are falling below the Militia here just because of that restricted versus mainstay. Now, kind of similar, but on the other side of the coin, we're going to have a look at Household Guard. Household Guard are a mainstay in many situations. They are a mainstay in the Feudal Noble Lord Warband, for example. Now, this is going to be a regiment where my opinion is going to differ quite a lot from other players, because ultimately, Household Guard are a regiment whose performance, whose feelings about you will have are going to change significantly based on your appetite for expensive versus inexpensive, efficiency versus focused regiment performance. Household Guard, generally speaking, are going to compete with men-at-arms. They are a mainstay regiment in a Foot Noble Lord's Warband, and we are kind of hungry for easy access to mainstay regiments to unlock restricted in his or her warband. And provided you spend the absolutely obligatory 15 points to take an Arms Master, at a slightly expensive 165 points for the base regiment, 40 points per additional stand, you get quite a lot of Cleave 1, Clash 3 attacks that will be further multiplied by the Noble Lord's Professional Troops aura. Now, ultimately, the over-under on Household Guard versus Men-at-Arms comes down to your value of resilience and cost versus damage output. Because stand for stand, there's almost no difference between Household Guard and Men-at-Arms. Household Guard have native defense 3, not a shield, which means they aren't vulnerable to flanking attacks or lanebreaker. They don't have access to Hardened 1, so usually, stand for stand, and definitely point for point, they will be much more fragile, but much more dangerous. You can overcome that fragility by taking things like the Armor of Dominion and Artifact, which will give them super hardened, which is really good. But mostly what they will do is let you invest quite a lot of points replacing a Man-at-Arms regiment with a unit that is just going to do a great deal more damage. The second use case for them, and one which I keep wanting to try but it keeps being just slightly too expensive, is as a second mainstay without a Noble Lord in them. Just running them by themselves in a Noble Lord's Warband, a regiment of 5 or 6. Now, ultimately, this has proven a little bit too expensive for me so far, but I think the idea does have merit, because they don't actually need a character embedded in them. A lot of regiments in 100 Kingdoms are kind of low resolve and reliant on embedded characters to overcome that. Things like Men-at-Arms, things like Militia, etc. Low resolve stats. But Household Guard are base resolve 3, which means they don't benefit at all from having a feudal lord in them. They just want the feudal lord's aura. If you can keep them close to the feudal lord in, say, unit of Men-at-Arms, you get all of those benefits with a unit that can keep pace with and wants to fight alongside the rest of the infantry line, and which is a mainstay. Now, the damage output is excellent. It's really, really quite good. The durability is a little bit of a challenge, and the cost I haven't quite been able to overcome, but that's a product of my own obsession with wringing every last ounce of efficiency out of the units that I play. And if you relax that just a little bit, you get a unit whose performance, maybe they are a little bit expensive, but their performance is eminently worthwhile. And for that reason, although I am probably personally the least prolific Household Guard user in the 100 Kingdoms, they still fit quite comfortably in the B tier. I'm going to slot them just to the right of Militia, but if you're a 100 Kingdoms player watching this, there is every chance they are a lot further up the B tier, or even possibly getting into the A tier, depending on what you personally value as a regiment. Now, next we have Household Knights, and these guys are kind of the poster boy for units whose points cost and balance position is really, really contingent on getting absolute maximum use out of them in a list. You have to layer every buff onto these guys. The good news is that you can layer every buff onto these guys. The peak of performance for a Household Knight regiment is defense 4 or 3 plus a shield, 5 attacks at clash 3, rerolling 6s to hit, rerolling 6s to defend, and then also benefiting from, for example, Theist Divine Purpose and Theist Indomitable and Theist The Spirit Shines. All of that is a tremendous amount of layered buffs. However, if you don't have access to any of those layered buffs, what you end up with is a 170 point unit. If they're not veteran, they're Clash 2. If they're Clash 2, their impacts basically do jack, and their ongoing melee kinda does jack. And if they're defense 4 and can't reroll 6s, well, defense 4 is still quite good, but they're only 4 stands per regiment and they're only resolve 3. And so in the absence of layered buffs, particularly given that they are a restricted regiment outside of the feudal mounted Lord's Warband, who is himself overcosted, you end up with a regiment that may actually be the worst value proposition in Conquest outside of some of the Squires masteries that literally don't do anything because they relate to rules that no longer are in the game. And so that gives you a hugely wide performance delta ultimately on this regiment, and I am sympathetic of the fact that Parabellum has to cost them according to the upper bounds of that performance profile rather than the lower bounds. It's very obvious why that is the case, but it means that even though Household Knights look like they have all of these different use cases, they actually don't. They don't have that many at all. They are useful if you can just about guarantee that they will always have the Feudal Lord bonus, and if they are veteran. Do not ever take them if they are not veteran. Do not take them if your battle plan is going to involve running them outside of the Feudal Lord aura. And frankly, probably don't take them if you don't also intend to get some other kind of buff on top, be it either the Order's army-wide special rule and activated supremacy, or the Theist same. Under those circumstances, you can make good use of them, and they can have real performance spikes. Something about Defense 4 Untouchable, reroll 6s to save, just has the potential to no-sell quite a lot of enemy attacks some of the time, which is a position that's otherwise not that easy to access in 100 Kingdoms. But for every game where I've had them do that, I have had games where they've just failed one too many saves, and then Resolve 3 kicks in and multiplies all of those failed wounds by 50%. And they have their third game in a row where they lose a melee combat against Fireforged, for example. That seems to happen an awful lot to me, actually. And so, while I think I can't in good conscience put them anywhere but B tier, for me they are in the bottom of B tier at the moment. My opinion on that might soften over time, and it would definitely soften if Parabellum was to just bake Clash 3 into the base profile and then just put some little splash in terms of Veteran being the special rule. Like make Veteran something other than +1 Clash. You cannot play these guys at Clash 2, which means that Veteran is illusory. You only ever take Knights if they are Veteran. That's a false choice, so just make them 170 points Clash 3, and then make Veterancy some other little thing, some really, really small rule. That is something I would very much advocate for, but at the moment, despite my misgivings, they absolutely can, at peak of performance, achieve very good results. And for that reason, they absolutely go in the B tier. Now, next up, we have longbows. This is the last of the feudal regiments that we'll be looking at. We've been going through the feudal so far, and longbows represent actually a rare apex of strength in the 100 Kingdoms in the sense of something that nobody else in the game can do. And it's not a massive thing, but it is significant. They can make range 24 volleys. That is the highest in the game. Nothing else in the entire game can make volleys at that range. The next closest is Marksman Clones at 22 inches, and then something like Caryatids at 20. And that's significant. Literally having the longest range of any unit in the entire game, that's a big deal. Now, longbows are restricted. They are a light regiment. They only have a few shots, only 3 shots per stand, so 10 shots for an MSU. But they do have Armor Piercing 1, which is quite nice to have, and they have Arcing Fire, which is quite nice to have. And their veteran ability, although it costs 10 points to unlock, is actually really nice. Their veteran ability is, I think it's called Advanced Marksman Training, and it gives them +1 barrage if firing inside effective range. Now, that is an ability that exists on another regiment in the faction, on crossbows, but there is a wide difference in performance between a bonus to being in effective range when you are a 22-inch range regiment and a 16-inch range regiment. And so for that reason, you can absolutely take longbows either as veteran or non-veteran. Depending on the points you have access to, you might choose to upgrade some of the regiments that don't get it for free if you have those points spare, but you can also very easily not do it. It's a genuine choice. I have run a list, for example, that runs multiple veteran and non-veteran longbow regiments, and access to them, even if you don't put them in a list, access to them helps give 100 Kingdoms a strength that no other faction, strictly speaking, can match. And that's really, really cool. They work very well either as minimum sized units or upscaling them just to 4 stands. That gives you a nice, impressive volley at short range. It isn't an overinvestment in the regiment. You don't start having to fight. If you go to 5 stands, they are unwieldy to use. I don't recommend that. But 4 stands is nice and comfortable in terms of a balance between damage, output, and cost, and does also make them a scoring regiment in 100 Kingdoms for as long as they have that 4th stand, but you can also easily run them as 3 stands just for poke, and it is poke that's really challenging to answer. Range on different regiments really does have an impact on their performance, because the shorter your range, the more and more likely you are entering into at least enemy march charge threat ranges. We will see that when we talk about mercenary crossbows, for example, and the fact that there is one unit in the entire game that can make a march charge clash from 22 inches away, longbow shooting range, and frankly, due to how the rules that enable that work, is unlikely to be able to do so against longbowmen unless you put a character in them, gives you the ability to just make multiple turns of poke and put your opponent under consistent pressure. Now, the damage output, particularly from an unaiming longbow regiment, is not high. If they march and shoot, they will land usually 3 hits, which against a defense 3 regiment will do like 2 wounds, and if you're shooting into tenacious things, that's down to 1. But the point is, you're doing that damage from 22 inches away, and that's a really big deal. That has a psychological effect, it has a play effect, and it makes longbows one of the most valuable units to have access to in the 100 Kingdoms and a genuine faction strength. In case it wasn't clear, A tier regiment. Next up, we have mercenary crossbows. Now, these are the far end of the coin. They are a relatively cheap mainstay regiment. They are Imperial with no other tags. They're going to be difficult to give any other tags. I think there's in fact no way to give them any other tag. They will always just be Imperial. And their stats generally are quite mediocre. They have bad defense, bad resolve. Their range is a tragically unimpressive 16 inches, and that 16 inches actually hurts. There are an awful lot of regiments that can get in on you and into combat and do damage to you from 16 to like 17 inches away. Multiple regiments in this game have a 17-inch do damage to you on the charge, whether it's a march charge with impacts like Thunder Riders, or even a charge clash, or a march charge from cavalry, right? Lots of things can in some capacity grapple with you from 16 inches away, and significantly fewer can do so from, for example, 18 inches. And so 16 inches of range on the mercenary crossbows really does limit them to a second rank fire support unit. You cannot skirmish with these guys. They will lose to every other counter skirmishing regiment in the game. They will lose to anything with loose formation. They will die in an absolute fire to Karez. They will be jumped by Moroi. They will be jumped by enemy light cavalry. You have to use these guys only as supporting elements once the range units have turned up. In that respect, them being light is almost a trap. They would be a much, much better medium regiment because of when they want to appear on the battlefield. I have, in fact, had multiple games where I've held mercenary crossbows back just because I didn't want them turning up until things like my men-at-arms block had arrived, which they could then turn up to support. A unit of mercenary crossbows hanging out behind men-at-arms, if you are playing against size 2 enemies, because that's a useless tactic if you're playing against enemy infantry, has actually served quite well, but ultimately their performance is pretty sharply limited. Now, at 110 points, there's a limit to what you can expect, but their veteran ability is also very expensive and not good on them, much compared to like completely different to longbows. They have the same advanced marksman training, but on longbows, it is a really serviceable 10 points for a long, effective range, right? On longbows, you could take it, you might not. It's a very good choice point in terms of list construction if you do or don't need those 10 points. 15 points for advanced marksman training on 16-inch range, 8-inch effective. Mercenary crossbows is an absolute joke. You will never pay for that. And what I have found is that for me, that limits them strictly to this unit escorts a chapter mage onto the battlefield. And in that role, they're fine. That's the best use case for them. You put a chapter mage in them, and then you have a serviceable regiment. I use them virtually none of the time at all outside of that very specific use case. Although if you wanted to, you can always use them to unlock mainstay choices in, say, feudal noble lord warbands, or even in Imperial officer warbands, although in Imperial officer warbands they compete very directly with Imperial Ranger Corps, which is the next unit that we'll talk about. Overall, for me, mercenary crossbowmen sit kind of middle of the C tier, just because they are ultimately completely uninspiring, and in my opinion, even generic mainstays accessible to most warbands of a faction should not be completely uninspiring. Now, up next we have Imperial Ranger Corps, who are 10 points more than mercenary crossbows, and share a huge number of the same problems as mercenary crossbows, in particular being range 16. But there are a few things that stand Imperial Ranger Corps out. Despite being 10 points more, they have a very, very similar offensive profile, but one which slightly benefits Imperial Ranger Corps. Mercenary crossbows have got armor piercing 1, Imperial Ranger Corps have volley 3. They are otherwise identical. Of the two, volley 3 is better than armor piercing 1. Now, the math on this is complicated and works out as a result of sum of factors changes. The fact that at range 16 you will often not have the luxury of aiming, which means that a higher volley means that you land a larger portion of shots, blah blah blah. Like, the way that the math works out is there is a small but non-negligible mathematical advantage to Imperial Ranger Corps, but it's small. It's like fractions of wounds per volley kind of thing, but it is there and it does matter. Much more significant is that Imperial Ranger Corps have fluid formation, which is just a really good rule. It's a really, really good rule. It makes them flexible. It turns them into an actual kind of skirmisher regiment, where mercenary crossbows, I mentioned, you have to bring mercenary crossbows in a position where they don't just die immediately because they're made of paper. Ranger Corps are made of the same paper. Technically speaking, they have evasion 1, which is not nothing, but otherwise they are very, very fragile for their points cost. But fluid formation means that you can move them forward, take some shots, turn around, take some shots, run the hell away, take some shots, which is a luxury that mercenary crossbows do not enjoy. If mercenary crossbows push too far forward, they're dead. If Ranger Corps push too far forward, they can get 12 inches back towards your lines if they absolutely have to. Maybe get healed up by a water mage if they took some damage overextending. They can play flexibly. And in fact, because of that, they can make plays. That is really useful and really cool. And although overall they're going to be just about in the C tier, because all of that cool stuff tends to add up to not actually very much damage or anything, they feel very cool in the process of doing not very much. Now, one of the things I do like to use them for is I also like to use them occasionally as a home for an Imperial officer. It doesn't feel great giving flank to a light regiment. It also doesn't feel great the fact that you've got Vanguard as a faction ability, but then you also get Vanguard on the Ranger Corps and the abilities don't stack. But part of making maximal use of an Imperial officer is getting those 12-inch hardened orders out onto regiments that need it. And what you can do is you can take, say, a feudal Imperial list, you can skimp on the seasoned veterans in men-at-arms regiments, deploy the Imperial officer in his ranges early and score, and then use their high speed and fluid formation to zip around to wherever you need to give out hardened to whatever units are fighting something that will require that. It's just a small efficiency that makes him kind of more useful and more interesting, and if he had better orders to give out, or other orders, or more choice of orders than he currently does, because right now he basically only has 1.5, he has hardened 1 and then the rally on those occasions where you need it, which is nice to have. That flexibility is really quite cool. So even though you're leaving some money on the table by not putting him in a regiment that actually would benefit from flank, it is a nice home for the Imperial officer, and they are a fun unit to play. They're not fantastic, like I said. They do all of this cool stuff, which then doesn't actually do much damage to your opponent, but they do all of this cool stuff. And so for that reason, I feel like they could sit somewhere between B and C tier. We do not have a C plus tier in this tier list, but I'm going to put them at the very top of C in recognition of maybe they don't do that much, but they feel really cool doing it. And so they are almost the best possible okay hear me out regiment because of how they feel to play. Now, sharing a kit but with a significant delta in performance from the Ranger Corps is our second unique Imperial regiment, and in fact one of the only other unique Imperial, certainly the only medium unique Imperial regiment, is the Hunter Cadre. Now, these guys are an extremely rare bird in a game like Conquest, which is that they are a multi-role regiment that is not overcosted. Now, hear me out in terms of this. Multi-role regiments are regiments that can do multiple things. In the form of Hunter Cadre, they can score reasonably effectively, they're good recipients of Vanguard, they're nice and fast, but the main thing is they can shoot with their crossbows, and they can fight in melee. They only have 4 attacks each, but they're Clash 3, Cleave 1, which is a totally reasonable offensive profile. Normally, being a regiment that is multi-role just dooms a unit in a game like Conquest, because the developers kind of have to cost them according to both of the things that they can do, which inevitably means that you have a unit that is too expensive to be any good as a ranged unit, and too expensive to be any good as a melee unit, and so it's always going to be bad no matter what it does, even if it has multiple use cases. Hunter Cadre very narrowly escape that, but they do escape it, and that makes them very good and very cool. Now, their ranged output is not great. In fact, it is literally identical to a unit of Hunter Cadre, except they do have Fiend Hunter. So if you're shooting brutes or monsters, you will get rerolls, which helps significantly. But their survivability, Evasion 2, Resolve 3, and Fearless, and their Speed 6 with a banner, and their frankly quite good melee stats, and the fact that they have flank, which is an excellent and rare rule these days, means that they are just a very consistent and useful addition to any list that they are in, almost regardless of the game state that they are deployed to. There is basically no situation in Conquest where you can't find some kind of a use for Hunter Cadre, whether it is to pepper the opponent with shots until they close, or to turn up in a flanking position, supporting another unit using their speed and vanguard, and make an attack in melee, or it's just to jump onto an objective zone. They can move 18 inches up the field on the turn that they arrive if they're giving vanguard from the Imperial supremacy, which is a huge amount of scoring potential. They just do stuff that's useful. And because they are not overcosted, right, coming in at 160 points for the regiment, instead of being consigned to the usual inevitable fate of multi-role units, which is too expensive for any of their use cases, they are in fact just about appropriately costed for all of them. Their ranged output ultimately is weak. My advice to you if you're a Hunter Cadre player is that if you see a charge, take the charge. Like, if you get to choose between an aimed effective range volley, right, which would be at 8 inches, or a 2+ rerollable charge into melee, most of the time, take the charge. You will do significantly more damage. But provided you think of them as a melee regiment who are misleadingly equipped with crossbows as the primary model, you will always get at least solid output out of them. Now, they are a restricted regiment in a warband, led by one of the less effective characters in the faction, and they are only Imperial. They have no other battlefield roles, which means they are not strong vehicles for force multiplication, but despite all of that, they are still a well-performing unit and are going right about up the top of B tier. My only complaint with them is that in their fluff they are described as being equipped with experimental crossbows, and their crossbows are obviously better and larger and more powerful than mercenary crossbows, but there is no mechanical difference between them. They used to be range 18, that got taken away, and I'm still slightly sad about that, but overall, the regiment delivers. Now, next up, continuing to move through our Imperial regiments, we have Steel Legion. Now, these guys are heavily armored, great sword-wielding regiments. They are, in fact, one of only 2 Cleave 2 regiments in the entirety of the other 100 Kingdoms. The other is literally a monster. And they are a 160-point heavy mainstay in the Imperial Officers' Warband. Those are the things about them that I can kind of reference as positives, although heavy is a significant drawback, but a necessary one. It fits their fluff. They shouldn't really be made into medium, for example, no matter how much the player base occasionally insists on that. The challenge that Steel Legion have is that they are a heavy regiment, and heavy regiments have performance obligations. Because they arrive late in the game, they will always be called on to influence the battlefield where they arrive, right? A late arriving unit cannot afford to do anything but be impactful in the position that they deploy to. Because they arrive late, that is a cost, it's an opportunity cost, it's less board presence, it's less power in your army until they arrive and then are able to enter into combat. It will be turn 4 at the very earliest before Steel Legion can perform an offensive action against the opponent. They must be able to meet this performance obligation, and much of the time they can't. This is probably the regiment that suffers the most from the human stats problem. They are Defense 3, Hardened 1, admittedly, not that you have difficult access to Hardened in the Imperial Officers Warband, but Hardened 1 and Bravery and Oblivious. Oblivious is a really weird rule on them thematically, but I'm sure there's some reason for it. But Resolve 3, Defense 3, 4 wounds per stand. And even though they are Oblivious, the thing about Oblivious is that it stops big spikes of resolve damage, but it doesn't stop resolve damage from occurring. And so it is very, very common for little incidental attacks to knock stands off of Steel Legion regiments. And because they are very expensive at 50 points per stand, particularly relative to the durability that they bring, you will usually only be able to run them in small units. You can try and run them a bit wider to take advantage of the Imperial Supremacy free reform, but they begin to get very expensive at that point. What tends to happen is that they will lose a stand just to something incidental. Some random spell, some random volley will knock a stand off of them, and they lose a third of their offensive output. And if a full unit of Steel Legion connects with the enemy, especially if they connect in the flank, they will generally do quite a lot of damage. In any situation other than that, they start to become quite anemic quite quickly, and particularly the extent to which they take chip damage, they lose one stand and then another to just any random bit of offense that comes their way. Their offensive potential very quickly peters off. And even though they are only 160 points, that means that they cannot fulfill the performance obligation that comes from being a heavy regiment. Now, the situation ultimately is not hopeless. They don't, for example, fall into D tier. They are just a bit behind the curve, and part of that being behind the curve is the fact that right now the game is slanted pretty significantly toward the earlier part of the game. A lot of players will focus their attention on arriving early and resolving the game state early, which is, I think, personally actually a little bit of a misidentification of how the game actually works by a lot of the player base. That's a whole separate thing that we could talk separately about, but I do feel like a lot of people don't remember that there are 10 turns in Conquest. Part of that is possibly to blame from the fact that in a tournament game, there aren't always necessarily 10 turns, unless tournament organizers provide fairly clear guidance about how to resolve the end of a game once the game state is actually in a resolved situation. But if you are able to play Conquest reasonably quickly and your opponent is also able to, 10 turns is an awful lot of time to reach the conclusion of a game. And my experience has been far more often than I think most people seem to realize, attrition does decide the flow of the game. It is not impossible for a player to be tabled and still win. It can be done, and I have seen it done, but it's not common. And so, much more often, I think players, if they were to actually study the flow of the game, they would find that, yes, in fact, the decisive points in the game are usually not scored on turn 2 or turn 3 or turn 4. But psychologically, that doesn't always happen. There is a psychological effect from having units on the board early. It looms large in player minds. There is a psychological effect on having points in the game early when your opponent doesn't, or vice versa. The psychological pressure of being 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 points behind for the first few turns of the game is very difficult to ignore, and I think that's probably part of what drives people toward playing the game with such a focus on early arrival, reliable arrival, not having anything arrive late. And that in turn flows on into a broad meta state in which games tend to be, resolved in the first, say, 2/3 minimum, but often the first half of the game, which means that heavy regiments have a performance obligation, and Steel Legion don't meet that. If the meta was to shift, if there was to be a bit more breathing room in the average resolution time for a game of Conquest, that would help Steel Legion a little bit, although it wouldn't really change the fact that they really take chip damage like absolute champions relative to their points cost, and for that reason, they absolutely don't fall into the D tier, but they're kind of lowish in the C tier. I am going to rank them above the Mounted Noble Lord because I hate the 50-point premium of the Mounted Noble Lord more than, the fact that the Steel Legion take chip damage. I can and have had games with Steel Legion where they've done some really cool things, but they have only ever done really cool things off the back of the sacrifices and setup of many other regiments, which in comparison to a lot of other heavies, and even heavies in 100 Kingdoms, other heavies can stand and fight alone. Steel Legion ultimately can't. They need other units to do the dying so that they can do the damage, and as a heavy unit with no ability to sustain chip damage, that puts them in a fundamentally fragile and difficult to use position, but not impossible to use, hence C tier. Next, we have Gilded Legion, and all of the problems that I've just mentioned about Steel Legion don't apply to Gilded Legion happily. Now, the offensive output on a stand-by-stand basis of Gilded Legion is going to be a bit lower. They have only 4 attacks per base stand, but they have support 3, which is wonderful. They have only cleave 1 rather than cleave 2. The damage output is just going to be lower than Steel Legion. However, Gilded Legion have Bastion, which is nice. They will always be in a warband with access to the Imperial officer, which means that they will easily be able to pick up Hardened 1, which means they can get to Defense 4 Hardened 1, and they have Pike formation. Now, it is often very reasonably said that activated defensive abilities, particularly defensive abilities like Bastion, have lower value than just having innate stats. Because you, and this is completely fair, because you need to activate the regiment to get Bastion, if you need to, for any reason, deprioritize them in the command stack, they're just not going to be Defense 4, they will be Defense 3. However, Gilded Legion have Pike formation, which doesn't alleviate that entirely, but it really helps because Pike formation is a defensive ability that is always on and disincentivizes the enemy from declaring charges against them. And if they're not having charges declared against them, the fact that that gives them the luxury to wait to activate Bastion. That abilities pairing pairs very nicely and helps shore up what would otherwise be kind of an awkwardness in their rules. The other thing that just really helps them avoid the challenges that Steel Legion have is that they cost 40 points per additional stand. Coupled with the fact that they are a support 3 regiment, and you have a unit that naturally incentivizes itself towards running relatively large. The bare minimum I have run these guys at is 5 stands plus an Imperial officer, but they can easily go to 6 stands or 7 stands or 8 stands. They scale up nicely because they are durable and they have support 3 and they have good clash and they have cleave. You can build these guys basically as tall as you want, and once you commit to investing in a unit that way, chip damage doesn't matter in the same way that it does for Steel Legion. Steel Legion are disincentivized from running in large units, Gilded Legion are not, and that makes all the difference. In the things you want them to do, ultimately, they won't fit into A tier. They are a restricted unit, you need to unlock them somehow. They do not have access to that many factional synergies because they are only an Imperial regiment, so no access to feudal, no access to Theist, etc., special rules, but they do what you need them to do, and they perform in that role well, and so they are a comfortable upper middle B tier, cleanly, nicely, just a good solid unit. We're actually going to pop these guys kind of ahead of the chapter mage, but really they do sit sort of like somewhere in about this position. All of the stuff here is just good and nice to have. Maybe we'll put them behind the chapter mage just slightly. Now, that's all of our Imperial regiments. Now we are on into Order regiments, and then we'll jump into our Theist exclusive regiments. Whew, this video has gone for a while. So, Order, we have 3 cavalry regiments to look at for now. Future Order regiments will come, but for now it's just these 3. Sealed Temple are the first and the only medium regiment. Now, this is a regiment that sits in kind of an awkward position because I don't actually particularly like them standalone. 200 points, 4 wounds per stand. Yes, defense 3 with a shield. Yes, resolve 4. Better defensive stats than, for example, Household Knights. But 200 points for 12 wounds worth of any dudes is a lot. And they're only 4 attacks per stand. And they have 4 impacts, which is class 3. That's pretty serviceable. 2 hits per stand. But there's no brutal impact there. They are trading exclusively on fluid formation. And the overall package for a 200 point MSU is actually not fantastic. It's not terrible, but it's weirdly not fantastic. I would, in a vacuum, kind of be putting them almost in sort of the bottom of B tier, which would probably feel like blasphemy for anyone who's played against them. But the thing is that they don't exist in a vacuum. They are going to be in a Priary Commander's warband, and they are a fantastic place to put any Priary Commander, Sealed Temple or Crimson Tower. Adding a Priary Commander to them does nothing to address their relative fragility, right? For the points, that is actually a very fragile unit. But it does 2 other things. Firstly, it adds a 4th stand to the regiment, which is the point at which fluid formation begins to really get some additional threat range happening off of speed 8 and a banner. So they can really motor, they can get around the battlefield very quickly, and they can make very long range charges. And the Priary Commander adds all of the damage output that the base Sealed Temple is missing. Like, they're not useless in a fight, but 4 attacks, 4 impacts, no cleave, whatever. Any Priary Commander, even with no upgrades, improves that significantly, and the moment you slap any upgrades onto that Priary Commander, or take, for example, a Crimson Tower Priary Commander to give terror, the unit starts doing absolute work. Now, it is premium. It is very expensive, but it performs so well in the cases where it is set up to succeed that is worth celebrating in that respect. Now, I still hold that orders overall are the most limited, not non-viable, just most limited sub-faction, but Steel Temple are a fantastic unit. I don't love taking a second of them in a warband. I think the second Steel Temple unit, it doesn't do that much for its points cost, but the first one, as a home to the Priary Commander, excellent choice. For that reason, we're popping them up to the very top of B tier, right next to Hunter Cadre, and on any given Sunday, which of those two you prefer just comes down to personal preference. I have a marginal preference for Imperial as a sub-faction. That makes the difference in this case, but really, those are both comfortably sitting at the very top of this band. Next up, we have Crimson Tower, and they're on the far other end of the spectrum. This is a C tier regiment. Now, Crimson Tower they are not exactly bad, but they are a unit that's sort of like consistently a little bit like Steel Legion, and spoiler alert, they're going to be sitting kind of close to Steel Legion. They're a unit that kind of fails to live up, especially to their weight class, but not to the same extent. On paper, they have a lot of what it is that they need to do. 5 wounds, they're one of the few regiments in 100 Kingdoms that exceeds the 4 wounds per stand mark. 5 attacks, Wedge, which will give them Cleave 1 on a charge. They have 4 impact attacks at Clash 3 with Brutal Impact 2 and Terror 1. And Defense 4, Effective Resolve 4. This is overall a pretty solid package, coming in at a slightly pricey, and that's really the main thing, slightly too pricey 210 points. On top of that, they have an ability, Devastating Charge, something like that, which is if they perform a march, then a charge, they get some small boosts to their impact attacks. Plus 1 impact attack and line breaker. You are not usually going to completely ravage an enemy regiment with that, but it means they have the option of marching and charging and doing some damage if they need to. Now, these guys, more than anyone, are a casualty to the current pace of the game. They are a heavy regiment. They will arrive on turn 3 at the earliest, and quite frequently they will arrive on turn 4, because if you're taking them, you're probably taking certain other heavy regiments, Ashen Dawn, that will have priority in terms of arrival, and that means that because they're arriving on turn 3 or more often turn 4, they will usually be thrust into the fighting where their presence is most needed. Now, that's a really cool fantasy, and that actually really does play into kind of how they should function. The orders have arrived. It's a really cool narrative moment, but what it means is that they are usually responding to where the enemy has allocated their greatest strength, their heavy regiments. And there are very few regiments in the game better suited at getting their asses absolutely whooped by enemy heavy regiments than the Crimson Tower. Defense 4, Resolve 4, is the perfect defensive stat to get completely cleaned up by Cleave 2, Terror 2, which is the kind of thing that you see on good quality enemy heavy regiments. Spoiler alert, 1 to come. Terror 1 in the case of the Archangel, but you get the idea. Crimson Tower are very good at punching down. Their Devastating Charge, which gives them Line Breaker, that is really only accessible, that only does anything against enemy medium regiments. Doing things like charging and then using Wedge and your impact attacks to really clean something up against an enemy unit that is pinned in place. That is mostly the use case for decisively resolving medium on medium fights that are already happening. Their use case is kind of clear, but it's difficult to have them deploy to that use case because as a late arriving heavy regiment, they are so often called to resolve situations that involve other enemy heavies, and they're just really, really bad at that. If you send these guys into something like a Ironclad Drake, for example, it is probably going to march charge them from across the table, kill one of them with its impacts, they will then dink at it a little bit without their charge, and then it will just clean them all the way up with its clash attack, just as an example. I've had these guys try and go up against City-States Giants, which are not the best heavy regiments in the game, but who will just absolutely shatter them with a clash. There's basically no heavy regiment that they fight effectively against because they are built to go against enemy medium regiments. And a heavy regiment that's good at killing mediums is just not something that I need in any game state. And so, despite the fact that the fantasy of how they play works quite well, and their rules do function, right? Being able to march and charge and do some damage, being able to charge and clash and do a lot of damage, how they works quite well. And I don't even particularly advocate for them becoming medium. They should be a heavy regiment. Like, look at them, they are obviously heavy. I frankly just think that at the moment, with the game state as it is, they just don't quite make their way into B tier because the game at large doesn't allow them to, even though there's no particular change I would advocate to their rules. They're probably very slightly too expensive, but that's basically it. And even points cost changes don't significantly move the needle because it's the game use of them and the pace of gameplay that they are exposed to that makes more of a difference. The biggest buff that would happen to something like Crimson Tower is actually a change to the scenario pack that changes scoring to move it later into the game, for example, not any specific buff that would be applied to them rules-wise. Their rules mostly function. And so for that reason, they're going to be sitting, somewhere about the top of C tier. We're going to put them just behind the Imperial Officer because the Imperial Officer ultimately does unlock access to an entire sub-faction, so I can't rank him that low, even if I personally wish his rules got cleaned up a little bit. Next up, and the last Orders Regiment, we have the Ashen Dawn. These guys are kind of superlative. They are a very, very big pile of stats that can fight kinda anything if they absolutely need to. Now, they don't like fighting Cleave any more than the Crimson Tower, but they will easily shrug off Terror because of Resolve 5 and Fearless, and with Blessed and 6 wounds per stand, there is no one thing that, apart from maybe a Siegebreaker Behemoth, that you are terrified to put Ashen Dawn into. Now, that should be the case, because it's a 260-point regiment. They should be able to fight just about any one thing if they absolutely have to. They'll fight things like, big Cleave 3 monsters, Cleave 2 monsters just about evenly, but otherwise they're a unit that is very well suited to turning up and then having a brawl to relieve some pressure wherever it is that they arrive. Now, the critical thing about using Ashen Dawn is that you need to arrange one-on-one fights with them, which can be easier said than done because they are very expensive, and they exist in orders where all of the regiments are very expensive. And so it can be difficult to take them in an army that is wide enough to actually comfortably accommodate them having one-on-one fights, but if you can do that, or you otherwise arrange the game state so that the Ashen Dawn only ever have to fight one thing at a time, they're really good, because Blessed as a rule shines in that case, and they will methodically win one fight after another, provided you don't let them get overwhelmed. Now that does put some restrictions on how you can use them. The worst possible thing to do with Ashen Dawn is to throw them into a fight that is basically already lost and where they can be ganged up on by multiple regiments, because Blessed falls apart at that point and you will lose your very expensive investment. But if you just arrange that one fight, then another fight, then another fight, you deploy them in a way where the enemy can't gang up on them, they will absolutely perform. They will perform well. Not like they used to be days where they were possibly one of the best units in the entire game. Those days have passed. They are fairly costed. Their durability, their offensive output, all of it is reasonable relative to the 260 points, but especially good defenses, high wound count, blessed, and serviceable offense adds up to a unit that works well, and for that reason, they go into just about the top of B tier. Now next we move on to the last 3 regiments, getting finally into the Theist exclusive units in the faction. Now obviously there are other Theist regiments, Militia are Theist, anything in the Crusading Lords warband is Theist, but these are exclusive Theist regiments, and the first of those are Crusaders. Now, Crusaders are very, very slightly overshone by men-at-arms in many of the situations they can be taken. That's kind of inevitable, right? When you have a pair of Clash 2, 4 attacks, 4 wound, Defense 2, Shield, Hardened 1 units, there is going to be one that is a little bit better because they are so similar. But there are 2 cases where the Crusaders outperform the Men-at-Arms, and that's enough to make for a good unit. The first of those is if you just kind of need an MSU that is a little bit durable and is a mainstay and unlocks some restricted, whatever, right? They are more serviceable as a mainstay than Men-at-Arms because they come with native Resolve 3, and otherwise are only 5 points more expensive than Men-at-Arms with a seasoned veteran. Just a little unit of these guys in a Crusading Lords warband is going to be Indomitable 2, Resolve 3, Defense 2, Hardened 1. For 130 points, that can take a punch. Now, regiments that are purely defensive, I don't have a ton of time for, but it is if you need something to just hold for just hold up and I'll get help, 130 points is sound for that. The other use case, and the use case which I will almost always put them to, is as a brick to put a Theist Priest in. Now, you have to have a Theist Priest if you're playing Theists. If you don't, a huge swath of your army just doesn't do anything in terms of special abilities. Because you take him, you have to put him somewhere. And there are basically 2 possibilities. Option 1 is you stash him in a unit of Militia Bowmen and you keep him as far away from danger as possible, and he occasionally throws out buff and offensive spells. Option 2 is to decide that you are going to make use of the fact that he has a spell that blesses his regiment, and you put him in a unit that makes use of that. Now, Sakari are an option, but the better option in my experience is about 5 veteran Crusaders. More if you have the points, but 5 is a good number. 4 is the bare minimum, but they will go the distance. It's worth paying for the extra if you can. You will want to prioritize getting Blessed off on that regiment at the beginning of the turn, and you will otherwise just have them grind and grind and grind against the enemy, just enduring, because Defense 2, Shield, Hardened 1, Resolve 3, Indomitable, with Blessed to reroll your defense rolls, is a unit that just Energizer bunnies its way through conflicts. Yes, they don't do a ton of damage, unless you take almost no hits, at which point you turn your Blessed into Flurry, and Flurry Flawless Strikes is actually a really good combination. But unless you do that, this unit is an anvil. And is it the best anvil in the game? No, but it's pretty good. And since you have to have a Theist Priest anyway, you may as well make use of him. And Crusaders are one of the best ways to make use of him. Ultimately, that puts them in a position where, yep, their applicability to the whole army, these are only a couple of use cases. But in those use cases, and particularly as a bunker for Theist Priests, they are good. In fact, they shine just in that narrow use case, and that makes them a really nice, clean, middle of B tier unit. Now, next we have Sakari, which actually are fresh off the back of a fairly significant buff. They have gone from 4 to 5 attacks, which is a 20% increase in damage output, or close enough to. And that actually genuinely gives them a solid role in the army. A little bit like quite a lot of units in Theist, they will serve best as a secondary mainstay in a Crusading Lord's Warband, but in that circumstance, they're very solid. Just taking them as MSUs, at 40 points per stand, they can be appealing to upscale, and you do have that option. But how I have personally found them most useful is as little MSUs, where the combination of Evasion 2, now Evasion 2 regiments will take a lot of damage, but they will not take a catastrophic amount of damage, and as long as Resolve holds, and Resolve 2 Indomitable 2 is very good Resolve, they will endure just a little longer than your opponent expects. Couple that with good damage, the threat they pose as flankers, they're a fantastic unit, and a medium unit, to sweep in and hit the flank of an enemy that is pinned down, and then use those limited defensive abilities to survive a counterstroke. I don't run them in every list, but I do like them in Theist armies, and they work very well in that kind of state. They fall a bit below some of the other pieces, like Crusaders, for example, but they're good, and I like them, and they fit nicely in B tier. Now, last, and absolutely not least, we have the 100 Kingdoms only monster, the Archangel. Now, she is a restricted, heavy regiment in Theists, but she is a really nice one. She has that wonderful mix of personal offensive output, speed, and support that makes her very useful in many circumstances. She can choose between 2 loadouts, Spear and Shield. Spear is very slightly better, so Spear and Shield and Sword. Spear and Shield is very slightly better, you guessed it, because of the Spear, the Shield, but both can be viable depending on what it is you're looking for. Now, the 2 main things she does is, firstly, she fights. 12 attacks, class 3, terror 2, cleave 2, terror 1, on a monster profile which does not degrade, is plenty of solid sustained damage output, and she is one of only 2 cleave 2 units in the entire faction. As a monster, she only needs to toe into contact with an enemy to get their full attacks, and so she works excellently at arriving and supporting other engaged units really solidly. She can decisively intervene in any fight that she engages in, and the fact that her spear profile gives regeneration out when she causes hits to enemies to friendly Theist infantry makes her even better at that kind of decisive divine intervention. Now, the other thing she does is she activates the divine purpose of everything nearby, which means she has a small mobility buff to your entire army, including herself. And that last bit is really one of the cherry on top pieces of little rules interaction that pushes her from, for me, B tier up to A tier. Because of the fact that she has divine purpose and it is always active because of the spirit glimmers, she's fast, she motors. She is just about effectively a speed 8 or even 9 monster, and that's quick, like speed 8 effectively. She moves 16 inches on the march if she needs to. She charges 9 plus d6. She's fast once she's on the battlefield. And that is incredibly valuable because a heavy regiment that can intervene decisively in a fight, win that fight for you, and then very quickly pivot to doing something else and intervening elsewhere, sweeping across the battlefield like the Angel of Vengeance that she is just about the best possible use case for a heavy regiment. Now, she is heavy. She is restricted. She's not easy to access. It's very difficult to run 2 of them. but a single Archangel represents, realistically, the best heavy in the faction by my merits. And so for that reason, we're putting her in A tier, and a well-deserved position it is. Middle of the faction there, really next to the Noble Lord and similar. Now, that's been a slog of a video, but it has been a fun and interesting, at least for me, excuse to talk about literally the entirety of the 100 Kingdoms faction. I do potentially intend to do these videos for other factions in Conquest as well, although my knowledge of different factions is not going to be as deep for other factions as it is for 100 Kingdoms. There are a few factions I play most in Conquest. 100 Kingdoms, unsurprisingly, is one of those. Now, that large and significant content dump now done, let me just conclude by saying I hope you enjoyed that very much. I do Conquest content more rarely than other pieces of content, but I do enjoy doing content about Conquest, and if you like that and you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I take requests for content, things like battle reports, faction focuses, etc. from channel supporters. That includes if people are interested in seeing more stuff about Conquest in future. If you liked this video, give it a like. If you're interested in seeing more, subscribe. And do let me know in the comments what kind of Conquest content you would like to see in future. I'm very interested in audience feedback on that and whether you found this interesting or a good listen. Otherwise, and for now, I'll be back in future with more content. Hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.